Hello and welcome to Rebuild. My name is Michael Belch, and as always, I'm joined by my brother, Bradley Belch. And we are very excited today to be able to interview Stephen Wolfe. The reason we are so excited about this is because here on Rebuild, our goal is to understand how we can rebuild society in a way that honors God. We believe that there are certain pillars that hold up a society and a country and a civilization, and that in a lot of ways, those have been degrading in our country over the last decades. And so our goal here, as always, is to understand what God's view and perspective are on those issues, how those pillars have crumbled, and then what we can do as individuals and as churches to help rebuild some of those foundations underneath it all. So today we are so excited to be able to talk to Stephen Wolfe about one of the big pillars underneath society, which is simply the perceived tension that sometimes we have as Christians between our identity as Christians, citizens of heaven, and also our identity within a nationality or a society here on earth, and in this case, our American identity. As always, if you are interested in this topic or other topics, you can find the rest of our work on our website, which is rebuildpodcast.org. If you're watching us on YouTube, we do post this to our podcast, which you can access through Apple, Spotify, Google, and the other main ones. If you're simply listening and you want to watch the interview, that's available on our YouTube channel, which is Rebuild Podcast. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and start introducing this topic a little bit. Stephen, thank you so much for coming on and giving us the time. And if I can just introduce you to our audience briefly, and then I'll hand it over to you to fill in any gaps. We feel like we are punching above our weight a little bit here because you have done a lot of work and thinking in this area. You studied at Louisiana State University, studied politics there, and currently you're doing postdoctoral work at Princeton University. You've also published articles on a variety of platforms such as Modern Reformation, Mere Orthodoxy, Chronicles Magazine, Sovereign Nations, and History of Political Thought. And if I understand correctly, you and your family are members of the PCA, and you have a passion to consider the political life from a Christian perspective. Did I miss anything important or anything that you want to add into there to kind of fill out the biography?
That covers I think everything except I am married and I have 4 kids, and soon will be moving to North Carolina. So start some online teaching. But other than that, I think you hit the highlights.
Okay, great. Well, to set up the dilemma here, I think that as Christians, it's easy to just start with this negative view of modern evangelicals are off base in a lot of ways. And yet, I think that as Christians, we really do have a legitimate desire to honor God with all of our life. And I think a lot of Christians have been kind of taken in by this idea that, okay, you want to honor God. That means that you need to embrace entirely this kind of heavenly identity and mindset and reject entirely or almost entirely any sort of earthly or kind of political national identity. And for a lot of people, I think it's maybe not those promoting and pushing and teaching these things, but for the average Christian, I think it's well-intentioned. They think, I want to love Jesus. I want to be, a citizen of heaven. And so they get kind of sucked into this idea of not considering what it means to be a citizen of earth as well. And so as we lay that kind of dichotomy, any introductory comments you want to make about kind of where the average Christian lies in the middle of this?
Yeah, it's hard to say what the average Christian thinks. It's easy to think that the average, it's just it depends on who you talk to. The best I can tell is that it's just kind of a jumble of thoughts. I think that the average evangelical has sometimes I've called it like a kit bag of these sayings and lines and cliches and mantras. And I don't know where they get them, probably from either Twitter or Facebook or from the pastor, and they tweet it out or post it out, whatever. And so I think they have kind of this collection of that. Sometimes it's Bible verses as well. But I don't think the average evangelical Christian, and this is true probably, throughout Christian history, has kind of developed, um, political theology that they can apply consistently, systematically. And I just say, I think this is what this is. I think evangelical elites or just, you know, clever people can use these lines like "you need to be heavenly minded" or something like that to get them to do things, to think a certain way, to not do things, and they use them as triggers for either action or inaction depending on what they want to do with them. And so in that sense, they can be easily manipulated. And I don't know if there's any way to actually solve that with the average evangelical. It's always going to be like that. It might be a matter of the elites just battling it out and seeing who gets to say what. But yeah, so I think that, yeah, to answer that with the average evangelical, well, I'll just leave it there.
Well, I think that, one of the interesting things in an article that you wrote, you were praising the idea of cultural Christianity, and the idea that people would have a tool bag or kind of a collections of sayings and phrases that they can kind of lean on. Would you say that's inherently a bad idea? Because I think that when that's informed by biblical perspectives, that is where most people live. And if they're common sense and they're, the things that they're saying to each other about how to get through life, if they're informed biblically, I think that can really be a tool of the church in keeping people thinking and living in a way that honors God. So is that necessarily an inherently bad position that
No,
people are
I
in?
actually don't think it's bad in itself, but I think the way that, because I tend to disagree with a lot of the people who would consider evangelical elites, I think they use that sort of thing wrongly, and so they manipulate, kind of gets at intentions. I think there is some of that, but yeah, I don't think it's wrong in itself. So I mean, in terms of just the American political life, we use the word liberty a lot. Give me liberty or death. There's all these phrases that we have that we can quote from different, from speeches of history, and these all matter in American political life, and they inspire action. I mean, that's what a lot of good political speeches. They're not syllogistic reasoning starting from a major premise moving down to a conclusion. They're using these tools to influence people to act a certain way. So I don't think it's wrong in itself. I don't think everyone's going, there's always going to be, I think, a sort of elite that do that. And I mean, this goes, I don't want to go too far in this, but it goes all the way back to just Aristotle's rhetoric. I mean, he's saying, well, what are we doing here? Well, we're in a democracy of sorts, and we have to be able to communicate to the crowd. How are we going to do that? Well, here are these ways. So it's, yeah, so I'm not opposed to it in itself. I think that the issue, though, is that I don't think most people who are evangelical elites actually have themselves a good political theology that they've developed. I think some do. I think some people like Jonathan Leeman, he has one, and several others. But there's a lot of people they're not theologians. They're really not even systematic thinkers. They're just good at using these things that can easily influence kind of the masses. I mean, that influence the masses is another topic conversation if they're even effective at that. But I think there's a lot of people what you might want to call like mid-levels who use these things and actually don't really know what they're doing. They're just good at packaging it and hitting submit or send or tweet. So,
do you? So one of the things, and this isn't exclusive to Christianity or the tensions within the evangelical church between big Eva, if you want, and kind of the smaller average American Christian. But there is certainly a tension right now with information overload and if you want to call it the elites trying to manage that because we have so much, we do have access to the information, but so much of the information is either dangerous to the normal way of thinking or just simply dangerous because it's not true. Do you think that the average American can pursue good information without kind of some guidance? How do we navigate the weeds of everything that's out there? Because I think there's a lot of people trying to find answers, but they get stuck in a rut, whichever way they go. So do you have any practical ways of suggesting or telling Christians how to navigate some of we want to earnestly find information, but we also want to stay grounded in some sort of, thinking that people like yourself and some of the bigger leaders that are thinking about these things, how do we navigate that?
Yeah, it's really challenging. Part of me wants to say, well, you just have to be online a lot, which itself has its own a lot of pitfalls. But what's interesting is if you are online a lot, you see things being worked out in terms of information in real time, depending on who you follow. So if you follow the right people, you can get someone saying this, the Russian-Ukraine war is a good example of all these these clearly things, either lies or fabrications of what was that guy, the pilot, and then Ukrainian pilot. Like there's just things that turn out to be false that are actually reported in mainstream news as being true. And you wouldn't sometimes even know that unless you were following these things on Twitter and had people who were pointing things out being false. A lot of people might still believe there was some Ukrainian pilot who was bombing, dozens of tanks and all that. So, yeah, I honestly don't know if I have a great answer for that. I think there are like trusted. I mean, there's people I prefer, of course, and I'm not going to say go talk to everyone. I think that there's papers like the Wall Street Journal that's I think a better national newspaper. I have disagreements with them and their opinion section, but yeah, I admit I don't have a great answer for that. I think people just have to find. I guess kind of thinking out loud here. I think one thing is social media is a good tool for this if you do it right, and follow the people you can trust, and the news sources you can trust, and test them versus other people and other outlets. And it's a matter of development. I mean, you can't rely on the nightly news anymore. There's the propaganda is pretty incredible. And also, I mean, maybe one solution is to focus a little bit on local politics. I mean, if you read your local paper, you can just drive down the road and confirm whether something was true or false.
Yeah.
Or your neighbor might know. So I think it's fair to say that a lot of Christians can get wrapped up in the national news cycle, and actually really just distracted. Like just, why? I'm bringing it up again. Like why is the average American obsessed with Ukraine and Russia? It's really strange. Why are we? It's like the latest Marvel movie, but real. And we have to somehow be glued and put flags. I mean, no matter what side you are on that conflict, and most people are on Ukraine's side. Yeah. Why are we obsessed with it? And it's because we've been kind of brought into this drama, engineered, I think, by the news media and others. So,
yeah, no, I think that's fine. I'm perfectly okay with kind of a tough spot, because what it tells me is it actually requires the average Christian, Americans, to do the work, actually pay some form of attention, because otherwise you will just get misled very easily. I mean, I completely agree. There's forces, big picture, that are trying to influence everything one way or another. And if you don't pay attention, then you will get misled. And I think that's kind of that. What that does is the more you pay attention, like you were saying with your initial answer, is being online quite a bit. The more you pay attention, the better your radar is for telling, if something, smells bad or stinks, or, you can start detecting and weeding those things out a little bit more. Now the issue is how do we get Christian, this is a different question, but how do we get Christians to actually believe that the time they put into it is worthwhile? That's a different game.
And just like, you don't want to kind of overestimate people's abilities too. So if you say stay online, well, be online, which I did say, a certain person, I think that would benefit them quite well. I think during, just say, after the election, recent presidential election, and there were a lot of people suggesting that there was all sorts of fraud and that Trump actually won. And that was something that me watching real time, you could see how people could make good points, and they'd show a graph and they'd show a spike, and then later turn out that all these things were, or many of those were not true. And so I think it's a kind of a precarious situation, throwing people online. They can be wrapped up in these things, and there's a lot of things, whether or not what you think about that election, a lot of things were indeed false, that were claimed to be fraud. So people get wrapped up in this. So I don't have a great answer, because I don't know if there is one
Yeah.
on this.
No.
And I mean, I actually, part of my answer is that, well, Christians should exercise political power. I mean, we tend to democratize things in the evangelical world. We tend to think that, well, if the average evangelical just thought like this, or did this,
Right.
or was wise like this, and here I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to do a podcast, and I'm going to tweet out this and that. But the average person is the average person. They're going to get caught up in all sorts of things, and pulled different directions. And but I think that this is one reason why it's good for Christians to be assertive in politics, is that you can use, you can use political power to destroy what is bad.
Yeah.
And to undermine, suppress, restrain what is bad. And that's one reason. I mean, either you use political power, or you expect the average evangelical to contend these things. And I mean, this goes back. Well, I mean, there is the issue is that you have nowadays, in a secular world, you have Christians, and they're contending with all these various forces in the world, from politics to at the job site, social forces, all telling them to believe this, that are all true, or just plain out absurd. And then you have families as another unit that can be a Christian family, and they're contending with this, and maybe they don't have the money to send their kids to private school, or they can't homeschool. And so we're basically disengaging from politics, assertive politics. We are then leaving families and individuals to contend kind of on their own.
Yeah.
And you think, well, they have the church, but churches are, you have a pastor who preaches, they can exercise discipline, they can train you in all sorts of ways, but sort of spiritual administration, of course, it's formative, it changes lives, but there is always there should be that Christians should recognize that there's another power ordained of God, which is political power, civil power, and that's ordained for our good, and so it should be used for our good. And so in that sense, Christian politics should be using or wielding the God ordained power to order the outward things in society, so that Christians don't have to deal with these things on their own. Again, otherwise we're democratizing all these things, and trying to make the average person be what maybe we think we are, or make everyone an aristocrat or an elite, but that's just not going to happen.
It seems like one of the things that's happened in American evangelicalism is that, obviously, I'm not advocating that the church should exercise, as an institution, the political power, but it seems like the church has de-emphasized and de-incentivized Christians from engaging in politics. And the idea that a pastor would encourage or promote the type of thinking, or really encourage one of his members to engage in political action, it seems very strange in the context we live in now. And yet, when you look at our history, Christians, there was the Black Coat Regiment in America. There was highly developed Christian statesmen who were talking about politics and government and all of these things. Why do you think it has happened that Christians and the church have been so reluctant and so suspicious of engaging in government and politics?
Yeah, I think first we should say that it appears to be that to be the case, because most of our leaders seem to push for that. They seem to push to, if not that we're politically inactive or passive, but to direct us in a certain direction, according to a principle of moral witness, which we can get into. But I think that I don't think they've been that effective. I mean, if you look at the presidential elections, it was like 80% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. That's the first time. And then you'd think after 4 years of being kind of browbeaten by these, by the evangelical Twitterati, you'd think that these guys, that we would not vote 80% for Trump, but we did again. I think we voted, it was higher percentage.
Except for the white evangelicals, the female.
They didn't. Yeah, well, there is definitely that trend of women voting for Democrats, especially if you're college educated. It's one of the most reliable demographics is college educated white women.
That's right.
Which is a bunch of ironies in that, but so I think that there's a difference between evangelical elite, what they're pushing, and it makes you wonder how these guys became like the leaders of us all, if they're not even effective in their own campaigns. But I think there is a push to be passive towards certain things and to be active towards others. So I don't think it's enough to say that they're pushing for political inaction, because I mean, in terms of the racial stuff, that was definitely pushed as something you should be active in. I mean, there were evangelical leaders who marched in BLM rallies, and there was definitely a push for that across the board, and a lot of kind of nasty things said at people who questioned all that. And so there definitely is activist in that sense. On the other end, there you see in terms of same-sex marriage and other things, you see them rejecting it, but also not as making a political issue, not something that we should push to overturn or anything of that sort. So
can I ask you something right there? Take a pause right there. Do you sense that these leaders, these evangelical leaders, or even this Christian nation at large, Christians in the nation, do we have a defeatist mentality on these principles? Is that part of the, like, is there just kind of a general sense that we will end up losing the battle anyways? Like, why didn't Christian leaders back in the 60s, and then back in what was Obergefell? Was that 90s?
That was
2000. Why have Christian leaders kind of rolled over? Because they'll fight it on the front end, right? And then when it happens, there's a certain like inevitability that, okay, well, I'm on to the next hill, right? Like, what is it? Is it a defeatism? Is it a focus our arrows on the present battle? Why do you think we kind of let things go generally as a Christian church?
Yeah.
Or maybe how can we combat that? How can we combat that kind of thinking?
Yeah, I think this arose partly because we as conservatives thought that we still kind of that America was still ours, but there was just some people who were presidents and leaders of institutions who went counter to that. And I think for a long time we were complacent, and we thought, well, if we just all get along and we be kind of universally affirm that you can be this, I can be that, you can leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. There was that mentality among a lot of conservatives. And part of the idea was that, well, you do that too. You leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. But that's, of course, not happened. That the opposite has happened, where Christians now, conservatives, I should say, generally want to be left alone, but the left won't leave them alone. And this is because the left, this is, I think, just one important rule of politics, is that the people who care the most will usually win. So you can be a minority, a tiny little minority, who thinks that a dude in a dress is a woman. can be just a small percentage, but you care a lot about that. And because you care a lot, you can actually change the entire country. And the left cares a lot, and conservatives care. I mean, we all care, but we don't care enough to go into the streets. We don't care enough to. You're not going to see Christians protesting in front of Supreme Court justice, in front of a,
Yeah.
you're not going to see them in front of Supreme Court justices protesting like that. You just, and it's not that we don't care, it's that we don't care as much. And so the left won because they're winning because they care more.
Yeah.
I think there is that. Conservatives were just, you see this all the way back from the post-World War II conservative kind of resurgence. There's that same sense of, okay, we're the American, like, we're liberal in a political philosophy sense, not in
a traditional sense.
Yeah, we're liberal, so live and let live and all that, and we'll just be free and small limited government, and we just are caught. Our principles can't contend with current reality. But I think for Christians, I think there is that same mentality is carried over into theology, where we are afraid of. We're afraid of looking as if we actually care too much about this world.
Mm-hmm.
So we're very susceptible. Like I mentioned, the kit bag of lines, mantras. We're very susceptible to accusations of idolatry. So if we care too much, there's no definition, there's no consistent application of what idolatry is. It's just a word that people toss out. But because we don't think systematically, that matters to us, and then we have to deny it. Oh, it's not idolatry, and then we see them caring too much. We say, oh, you're idolatrous, and it doesn't actually it's not effective. But it in the end, for us, we react to that and then kind of disengage. The same is true of like hypocrisy. So if Christians are accused of hypocrisy, somehow that just shuts us down. So you care about gay marriage and this thing? Well, there's some pastor in I don't know, in Wisconsin that had an affair. Well, what are you going to say about that, Christians? Like, well, I live in Texas, So it's like, or I just read here that all these sex scandals in the Southern Baptists. Like, well, I'm Presbyterian, but it doesn't matter, because you can be accused of these things over and over, and so we disengage. And but this goes way back. I mean, what's fascinating is that if you read people like Rousseau, I think Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his book Social Contract, near the end, he has a section on civil religion, where he talks about religion, and then he also talks about civil religion. He says that Christianity is essentially it's a religion for slaves, because if you're a Christian in a country and it's doing well, then you feel like you care too much about your country. And if it's doing poorly, well, you like it doing poorly, because then you can show off your heavenly morality. Because essentially, he's saying that Christianity can never actually be it can never be a stable religion. In order to have a Christian nation, or actually, in his terms, a Christian republic, you have to basically not be Christian. You can be kind of Christian in name only. But in order for that, and he had a point. Not that I think he's right about Christianity, but Christians do tend to be like that. Yeah. They are very afraid of their nation being glorious, or their nation being strong, but then when you see this today, when your nation starts actually becoming weaker, or you become marginalized in your own nation, you now have all this theology of suffering and this theology of marginalization coming in to actually justify and in a sense, not enjoy. Kind of too perverse, but it kind of seems like that, but to actually like being marginalized, and to not only to accept it, but to kind of glory in it.
I think there's a sense that we look in the New Testament and we see, all who desire to be followers of Christ are going to be persecuted, right? And I think there's a sense in America where we have not, because of the cultural Christianity that has been present for so long, we haven't faced the sort of persecution that we see either in the history of the Christian church or currently in other places of the world. And so I think you're absolutely right, where there's kind of that sense of we are not living Christian life the right way because we have created a society that doesn't persecute us. And I think that's a really interesting and convoluted way of thinking about the influence that Christianity ought to have in a culture. So I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, on cultural, yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier I defend cultural Christianity. I think that it boggles my mind that anyone who has young children today would not want the neighbor kid to have parents who are at least nominally Christian. There's an article that Russell Moore wrote about seven or 8 years ago, where he basically says that long live secularism, just bring it on. That cultural Christianity is bad, and it's got to go. And it's kind of a shocking article. But as someone who has young kids now, you can't just. It's not like it feels. It's different than when I grew up, and I grew up in kind of California, which is kind of secular, but.
Kind of.
But yeah, I mean, in the 80s, California's changed a lot. It was, but that's a different topic. But yeah, I mean, you think that how would you not want this at least nominal Christian? And more than I think that's also cultural Christianity. I think that it prepares people to accept the faith. Yes, it undermines like the hostility towards the faith, which means that you have to call people to faithfulness instead of having to convince them that God exists, that Christianity is true, that the Bible is the Word of God. You don't have to convince people as much as that. You have to just call them to faithfulness. And, if they're baptized as babies, it's probably a little easier that way. But
go ahead.
Yeah, I just say, like, I think it's really foolish of us to not. The reason people don't want cultural Christianity is you have people enforcing it socially through social power, through that kind of that glance that people look at and say, don't do that. And it's that outward. I think Christians today are like you mentioned earlier, like the idea of being heavenly minded. They want us to like walk through all of life as being like a sort of holy man who
above the fray.
Never does a stern word. Our politics is pure, so we never actually get anything done politically, but we at least said something that sounds really pure and holy.
Yeah.
We never kind of have this sort of righteous indignation for our homeland, and it's all it's all very kind of pacifist.
Yeah,
but in the end, you get a world like ours today, which is hostile to the faith.
Well, I think, two things. One, going back to the people who care more. You're absolutely right on that. My only point there is on the flip side, on the positive side of that, is we see the abortion movement, the anti-abortion movement, the pro-life, so to speak, or the abolition. We see more momentum on that side because right now Christians are the ones who care more about that issue. The left has kind of generally said or believe that they've won on it. They held Roe versus Wade as completely untouchable. And Christians have slowly, finally pushed enough, good pro-life movements and abolitionist movements, anti-abortion abolitionist movements have really gained a lot of ground there because we have cared more on that topic. So that's just an encouragement on that front that Christians actually, when they do care, they actually can make inroads. And then secondly, on the sense of Christian, wanting Christian neighbors, I think a lot of people think that they can insulate their kids from the secular world. They can kind of send them into a Christian school and they'll be fine, but without actually building anything for them, building anything around them to create kind of safety nets or societal norms built in. So I think which I think is terribly misleading to think that you can live in the world we live in and prevent your children from being exposed to it, or even if they are exposed, give them enough groundwork, just you on your own, to fend off all that is going to come at them. I think that's really misleading, and I completely agree. I think Christians should want their neighbors, their schools, their cities to be built in a way that fosters as much of a fertile soil for the gospel as possible. But let's transition a little bit into kind of the analogy that you've made between Christian marriage and being a Christian citizen. and maybe you can talk a little bit about properly understanding their nationality as Christians. Maybe talk on that comparison that you made before.
Yeah. So a lot of my arguments related to the Christians and nation and Christian nationalism, I rely on kind of the analogy with the Christian family. The family is a natural thing, so it's something that's instituted at creation, and so it's a natural thing. It's not a product of grace. It's not a supernatural society in itself. It's fundamentally natural, which means that's why it's universal. It's why non-Christians can have legitimate marriages and all that. So, but at the same time, we would affirm that that natural union or that family can be a Christian family, and but it being Christian does not mean that it eliminates nature. So you can think the idea that grace perfects nature. The Christian being a Christian family is not a different sort of family in itself than a non-Christian family. It's the same. Fundamentally, it's the same. But a Christian family takes that natural family and orders it to Christ, and so you do family worship in Christ. You forgive one another in Christ. You identify as Christian. In general, you order it to that. At the same time, let's say a family let's say a household becomes a Christian household. That doesn't eliminate the particular features of that. I mean, you might like board games, and that doesn't change that you all like playing board games. It doesn't change these other particularities of what makes you as a family different from another family. So I use that to say that a nation that becomes Christian is fundamentally something more a natural thing that's become in a sense Christianized. So that would mean that a nation that has natural particulars, you can distinguish the French and Germans and Italians, and they have these particular things about them as Italians, as Germans, or Americans, and becoming Christian does not eliminate your Frenchness. It doesn't eliminate your Germanness. So you can still be fundamentally a nation that is different. Or put it differently, you can have different Christian nations, and each is actually very different in their particularity. But also the Christian element. The Christian element for like a nation would be that the nation's oriented to Christ. And so you have your politics. I think that the principal feature would be the ordering people to heavenly life or to the church. It'd be basically supporting, protecting the instituted church. I think that would be the principal action of a Christian nation. But in doing that, I mean, it's that they're not extinguishing their particularity. So to be that's why I think the article you're referring to, I say it's okay. It's something like it's okay to be a Christian American, and and a lot of people want to say American Christian, and that's fine. But the point I was trying to get at with the title is that you can be an American, you can have this particular way of life, and that the Christian element is something that is then ordered to Christ. It's so it doesn't eliminate or extinguish. There's no like robust gospel culture that's universal that every Christian nation is going to somehow all be the same. So that's what that's a long-winded way to answer the question, but that's why I use the Christian family that way.
Do we make a category error when we pit citizen of heaven against citizen of an earthly
country? I mean that's a major problem today. It's solved by the traditional understanding of two kingdom theology, which there is a difference between the modern version, but it's still the idea that that you could say two dual citizens of a sort, but it's heaven and earth, to put it generally. And so you're a citizen of heaven. That doesn't mean you're a citizen of the instituted church. That's a little bit different. But they shouldn't be pit against each other. In fact, I think that your loyalty to your earthly home is in a way loyalty to the heavenly kingdom, because in being loyal to your earthly home, you're actually creating conditions in which people can pursue their pilgrimage to the celestial city. So if you, or that if you have a peaceful civil society, or let's just say a civil society that is outwardly ordered to heavenly things, well, then you can actually pursue your life, and your pursuit of heaven is actually done with ease. And that is, it's not just ease, but also an encouragement. And so in that sense, they should not be opposed. That they're actually complementary. I mean, the lower should serve the higher. So the lower, the earthly realm is, they're not co-equals in that sense, but the lower realm should be ordered to the higher. And the best way to do that, I think, would be to make Christian nations and Christian governments and Christian civil societies.
I for,
and so, and that's it. Let me just do this final thing.
Go ahead.
And it's important that this is one of the confusions. To say that you want a Christian nation and you want a Christian state or a Christian commonwealth, just like when you say you want to say a Christian family, you want a Christian family, you're not, to use a popular phrase, immanentizing the eschaton. You're not bringing heaven to earth. You're not bringing the kingdom of God. You're not immanentizing or making external the kingdom of God. You're not pulling the New Jerusalem down to earth. You're simply ordering things according to earthly life to the heavenly life. So it's not as if, oh, we're a Christian nation now, it's like heaven now. No, you still get married, you still have kids, you still do the things that that are fundamental features of temporal life that we're likely not going to do in heaven. You still do all those things, but it's ordered to heavenly life. So perfectly complementary. And so to say Christian nation, Christian family, Christian state, Christian society is not then to say all of that is heaven, as if we yanked it down. Hope that makes sense.
No, it does.
Is that why Jesus in the disciples' prayer, the Lord's Prayer, I mean, his commendation to them is to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I mean, that's an interesting idea that you are saying, that we are to propel our behavior here so that it would be heavenly. Not that we are going the other way around. And I think that order is really important. What you're saying there about how,
I mean, I think that's why I use the Christian family. Just think of, we can think of, I mean, I grew up in a non-Christian home, so I can think of this, of the idea of just a natural family doing natural family things, and so nothing Christian. And then suddenly that household becomes Christian. And now that family, which is still fundamentally the same, generally same personality and a lot of the same activities you did probably before, and rhythm of life and your job and all that. Now you're going to church together. Now you're praying together. Now you're reading the Bible together. Now you're calling for reconciliation between the kids when they sin against each other. So fundamentally, you're still kind of the same thing, generally speaking. Of course, there'd be things that are corrected, but yeah, but now these things are they're ordered. Now the whole household as a whole is ordered to the spiritual good.
Is there any sense? I think I've heard it said, I forget who said it, that part of all of this plays to honoring your father and mother. The Bible has a lot of genealogies, which to me point to family after family after family after family being raised in the Bible's case, in Israel's nation. Is there any sense in taking pride in the nation, playing back to a certain aspect of honoring our father and our mother, because they are part of a nation? Part of the honoring them is honoring the way of life that they live, and in that, in our case, is an American nation. Does that play at all in the Bible, in theology wise, from another angle that we can look at this?
Yeah, I think, I actually wrote down on my notes here, fifth commandment. So I think that's absolutely the case, that it's a matter of honoring your father and mother. If you think about not only can you see in yourself, you can see that you can see your father in yourself, or you can kind of see these traits, some good and some bad, of course. And um, but uh, but yeah, I mean, our social is so much of who we are, and our socialization, the way we relate to the world, is because of ancestors in the past, the immediate family, even beyond that. I mean, think about the reason that we can continue on as a nation or just as a people is that the products of our ancestors endure. So buildings last and streets last, unless you're in California. I mean, like all these things actually endure across time. So when they die, the new generation is here on the things that they built. And that's true for house. I mean, it's true for all sorts of things. So pretty much like the things that help us, that aid us in this life, are products of, oftentimes products of the past. So in that sense, you could see the world as a gift. It's a gift of actual people, not only a gift of God, but actual people who worked and to provide for what you live in. So I think there has to be a sort of gratitude. I mean, there's even some people like Aquinas goes all the way to say basically you need to worship your. I mean, worship sounds, that's probably not as helpful as other words, but that's kind of the word. He says that even they're supposed to be shown a sort of piety towards ancestors and your family, because there should be this sense of gratitude for what they have provided. And I think that, I mean, I don't know your guys' background, but the like our family, our relatives, like acting in the world, doing things in the world, they in a sense leave a trace behind. So you might think of my father, grandfather built this, or he did this there. And now I have it, or now I can experience it, or now I can kind of relive it. There was someone on my podcast, someone came on and they said that they would that he learned, or that his grandparents owned this house, and there's a big porch, and they learned, like they taught him all sorts of wisdom on that porch, and they told him, I think that they like told him that they taught him about Christ, all sorts of things that they taught him, and that porch has a lot of significant meaning to him. And so he drives past it. I guess they didn't kind of follow in the family, but he now can kind of relive, in a sense, relive those experiences with his grandparents from the porch. And you can expand that out to the nation, or the town that your parents were married in and they grew up in, and here's where they grew up. I mean, you can just go on and see how our world is in a sense enlivened by the past acts, and it's something it's so familiar to us that we don't reflect on it. And I think nowadays, in a time where we're very kind of unsure of our Christian place in the world, that we should stop and actually deliberately reflect on these things.
Yeah.
Especially if you live in the same hometown, you should deliberately think about these things.
Yeah, and on the flip side of that, you see, any Marxist-based movement attacks first and foremost the past, the legends of the past, and the family structure, whether they know it or not, because that is the foundation laid for us. And you're absolutely right. A gratitude, an appreciativeness, a desire to build upon what has been laid for us and make it better. All of that is intrinsically, I would argue, godly, and certainly built into the fabric of America from the start. But that they attack it because they either have to respond in gratitude, or they respond in rebellion to it.
Yeah, I think the left, I think they know that if you want to destroy American conservatives, then you have to destroy their connection to the past. So you have to make it so that their entire world, because I want to say like that our world is in a sense, it's not just geographic space out there. It's places where people have done things and built things, people you love. And so to denigrate that, is to disconnect you from that. And if you can disconnect Americans from their past, or anyone, you can disconnect anyone from their past, then it's easy to get them on board with destroying it or whatever. And I think the left knows that. So if your view of American history is that it's just fundamentally corrupt and bad and irredeemably bad, and every person and point in history is bad, uniquely bad, except it's interesting how they tend to think that America is exceptionally bad. So it's not we're an exceptionally good nation, we're
American
exceptionally
exceptionalism.
bad. But yeah, you sever people from place, and you make it easy to destroy and kind of replace that place with something else. So yeah, I think that's the left's tactic, and that's why they go after history so strongly. I mean, so.
Yeah, which is why I bring up the tie to honoring your father and mother, because I think we as Christians can feel a sense of like, well, why are we trying to defend this? Like, this is just an earthly thing we're trying to defend. But when you tie it to a commandment, the fifth commandment of honoring your father and mother, you can kind of get some ground under your feet to say, oh no, there's actually like biblical significance and commandments to why I can defend this. But again, that's a whole critical thinking framework that needs to be better fostered in the church, in my opinion, the church at large.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, I mean, I'd hope that we'd get that pastors would get better political theology, and that they can that these dichotomies that people present between heaven and earth, and that these can be shown as false dichotomies, and they're actually very complementary. I'm not a huge fan of making pastors very political, but I do think there's something for pastors telling their congregation that it's good to love your people in your place, and to it's good to love your ancestors. It's good to want to have gratitude for that and to build upon it, and and then also supply the theology to. I guess another thing is just affirming our humanity. Yeah. There's a great line in this guy named Franciscus Junius. He's just an old theologian that, but I don't know if you can know him. But he says that we're Christian human beings. So we're not just Christians or human beings. We're Christian human beings, which means that we're humans, and which means that grace does not destroy nature, pretty much. And so whatever is true of man to his being and his nature, as nature as created, not as sinful, is also true of a Christian. And a Christian is an earthbound being. A Christian is one who has ancestors and a country and a nation and a people, and those are supposed to be all a part of the human loves. And Christ did not come to destroy any of that. I mean, he came. He came to, he affirmed. Basically, grace affirms nature and all that goes with it. So, instead of setting these things as opposed to one another, I'd hope that the work would be in figuring out how to articulate how they complement one another. So I think that's kind of one of the big things pastors can do. Like, how do you complement human in your Christian life instead of setting them opposed, but and something that leads you to being a kind of a complete human. A complete human I guess this is kind of like my Christian Aristotelianism, I suppose, but a complete human, I can't imagine that a Christian is in a perfect state or complete state of good if they're suffering tremendously from persecution, and yet they are still very heavenly minded, which is good. I mean, of course, if you're suffering, that's the right place you want to be. But it's hard to say that's the complete good. So the complete good would be that you contemplate heavenly, eternal things to come, and at the same time you're working as an earthbound being for that good as well. So that's the kind of the complete good. And I'd hope that in our world that would be something emphasized. And so instead of just saying kind of glory in your suffering, which is true, that we'd also say, well, but that's not like the complete perfect state that we as Christian human beings want to be.
In a minute, I'm going to ask you for maybe a couple of resources specifically to help Christians and even pastors develop a more robust political theology. But the last question I want to ask you is very practical in nature. We started talking about, and I was rebuked somewhat, the mythical average evangelical Christian. But I do wonder if you have just a couple quick practical comments to Christians, specifically in the sense where right now as Christians, there's a large concerted effort telling us be ashamed of the past of America and be proud of the progressive movement of tolerance and inclusion, where we are opening up, marriage to same sex and all of the progressive things that are going on. And so we're told, be ashamed of that past, be proud of what's going on now. And yet when I think about America, I'm proud of the past. I'm proud that we ended slavery. I'm proud of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And I'm ashamed of what we're doing now. I'm ashamed that our embassies and our military bases fly the pride flag, or the pride progress flag now, I guess is what it is. And so I wonder if you have any practical advice to include for Christians on how they ought to think, because I think I'm a proud American. But what I mean is I'm proud of our heritage. I'm not proud of what's going on largely right now. So any practical advice for Christians as they think about their American identity and how they ought to behave in light of that?
I think one thing is that as much as the left has and will continue to kind of replace the myths and the history of the United States, and they'll downplay some holidays and this and that, but I don't think they'll ever actually be comfortable with the flag. And I don't say this, it sounds sentimental, like I guess it kind of is, but I don't think that they will ever be proud flyers or wavers of the American flag. I think they will very proudly wave the rainbow flag with its new colors and all that. They'll do that wholeheartedly, but I can't believe that they'll ever actually wave. So I think so we know that they've taken all our institutions. They have the military. The military, like you said, waves the pride flag. But I think that as Americans, I think waving the flag will always be our thing. And so I think don't give that up. I understand, I would say, look, I know maybe your father went in the military, your grandfather fought in World War II or Vietnam or whatever, and your brother or whatever is in the military, but it's not the same institution, and you don't want to go fight in order to wave a trans flag in Afghanistan. So I would say don't join the military. I think it's captured. That's one recommendation. But again, I'd say wave the flag. They're never going to be comfortable with it because they know it represents a sort of old time America that they're not going to like. So I think don't give them up on that. I think the other thing is that we have to be more comfortable. We have to be more comfortable with political power being used against our enemies. I mean, just say it straight. I mean, we have to. And it doesn't you say our enemies. I think a drag queen kids hour is not our enemy. It's an enemy to the human race. I mean, so it's like if there's any job for a civil government, it's shutting that down and throwing people in jail. And that should just be obvious. And you say, well, yeah, we're Americans. Go back to the founding. I mean, there were blasphemy laws back in the founding era. There were established churches until 1830. They had Sabbath laws for years. Some Sabbath laws still exist. We had these things in the past. So let's if we want all about the past, let's look back and say, I'm not saying bring back blasphemy laws, which I'd be okay with, but I'm saying there was a willingness to assert a certain level of morality in law. And so I think we should get behind people like DeSantis and others who want to use their political office as as ordained. I mean, it's ordained. I mean, it's like sometimes we treat civil power as if it's this foreign, almost evil thing, or even neutral. No, it was positively ordained by God. I mean, it's literally Biden and DeSantis. These guys have their power that they can say, do this, don't do that, is of God. And then if they command you to do something that's just,
Right.
it's backed by God. In a sense, it's an ordinance of God. Like to a just civil law is God telling you to do something, even though it was mediated through a human. So why wouldn't we then call for our magistrates to do these things? And so I think getting over the 80s and 90s conservatism and adopting better, I'd say even more conservative and traditional principles of government in that regard. So I hope that's helpful. But
no, it is, and I'll just piggyback off that a little bit. Along with that, you get the Christian tone police that say, well, I just don't, because typically to elect that person, right? Trump being the prima facie case of it, it's going to be a bombastic. They're not always going to be elegant or polite. In fact, sometimes, most often, even just downright rude. But I weary of those who steer away from that just because of that. But also don't present the alternative, because their alternative is just the same retread that we've had forever. Like you say, going back into the 80s and the 90s politics. So I don't want to get behind or support personalities like Trump necessarily. But if that's what's going to break through this kind of barrier that we have of getting to the Ron DeSantises, I would argue that we wouldn't have Ron DeSantis if we didn't have Trump be who Trump was. Right. So I think we need Christians that are willing to break a few glasses while reorganizing the kitchen a little bit. Obviously the ideal would be don't break the glasses. But the kitchen needs to be reorganized. And if that means a few eggs are cracked or a few glasses are broken while we're doing that, we can call that out when that happens, and we can say, that's wrong or that's bad. But to be afraid or ashamed to support people that are outgoing and forward and willing to fight the fight, I think is a good place to start on that. Because you're absolutely right. We got to get away from the retreads and the same old.
Yeah, Trump. I mean, Trump is in many ways is. Well, I was going to say he's a moron, but I mean,
it's fine to say it. He is.
I'll say I voted for him twice. I voted for him twice, and I guess a supporter given the options. Yep. And I liked a lot of things he did, and some of the things he didn't. And I think, even though I think as a president he could have been a lot better, but he's good in this sense, is that he opened the door for people like DeSantis and others to say you can be a different type of conservative, and you don't have to play the media games. So you can. What was great about Trump is that he would just play he would play the media, like he would just. I remember one time there was like this, he had a scandal during the campaign in 2016, and he told the media, and there's a big scandal. I forget I think it was the locker room talk thing. Mm-hmm. And he told them that, I'm going to make an announcement. And so the media, every single channel put him on the air, every single channel. And he talked for 45 minutes about policy and being a president and how bad Hillary, going to jail, and crooked Hillary and all that. And in the last 30 seconds, he's like, oh yeah, and what I did back then was bad. And see you later. Bye.
Yeah.
So he just played the media, because the media is like, he's going to make this announcement. No, he had a 45-minute campaign speech that was aired across all the networks. So, I mean, there's a lot of things to not like about Trump. Yeah. In all sorts of different areas, but I do think but he opened up this idea that you need to be wise and stop being so utterly polite that you're played by the media and others. and kind of fight back. And because there's so much nonsense and BS in our world today, that just confidently in saying no and saying for what it is, it just gets, people will just love that. And Trump kind of showed that to a large degree.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the love with kindness or win it with love is a great slogan or a great idea, but both those words, kindness and love, have been so distorted that we don't even know what that means anymore. And so when we make truth claims, when we say confidently, this is what I believe and this is what I'm going to support, almost irregardless of what you say. Now I'll listen to any argument, but almost irregardless of what you say, I know this to be a biblical principle. I'm going to fight for it. People say, well, that's just not kind, or that's just not tolerant. And to stand up and say, yeah, okay, if that's what if that's what you think, I'm sorry. Be polite as you can. And we don't want to get into the heated, passionate stuff, because that does lead down. I mean, I'm not saying don't be passionate, but the where our passions are driving us, because ultimately we know that our confidence is in Christ, and I think that's where Christians definitely have it right. Our confidence is in Christ, and in our eternal hope. But I think that only gives us more reason to be level-headed and convicted in our principles as we navigate the human part of Earth.
Well, that's well said. I'm going to draw things to a close here. Stephen, could you tell us a little bit about how people can find more out about you and your work? You mentioned your podcast. And also, if you could tack on one or two recommendations on developing political theology, we would appreciate that too, if you have any off the top of your head.
Yeah, so I do a podcast we say weekly. It ends up being every other week, but it's Ars Politica, Ars Political, ARS, and Politica. And we've been doing it for a couple of years with Thomas Acord and I, a friend from Louisiana when I lived there. And so you can find it there. On Twitter, I'm at Perfinjust. I don't know if you guys have show notes. It's hard to, but yeah, okay. You can follow me there for whatever crazy tweetery I do. Let's see. I should be in the next few months coming out with a book on it's going to be I don't know the title, but it's a defense of Christian nationalism. So I'm just directly going to go in there and say, yeah, it is a thing and it's good. And hopefully that comes out in the next few months, and it's going to be based in classical. It'll be based on kind of classical Protestant principles. So I think in terms of recommendations, I like a lot of the older books. I think they were better at distinct. I don't want to say nuance, but they're better at distinguishing things. And they knew, theologians back in the day, they knew theology and politics. They knew it all. They knew what the law, and it's nowadays people are trying to make political comments, and all they have is an MDiv, and they don't realize the level of learning we had in the past. But I think for theology, just for theology, you guys know, like Francis Turretin's my favorite. It's very dense and deep, but you really can't get anything better than that in terms of reformed theology. So I definitely recommend that. He doesn't really talk a lot about political theology, but just like any field, everything's connected. So I also like Althusius, Johannes Althusius. He wrote a book called Politica. That's early 17th century. And there's these other books that have come out. I mentioned Junius before. The Mosaic Polity is a good book on law, and how the Mosaic law relates to civil law today. So I think those books would be really good for people to pick up.
Can I ask real quick, just playing off of that, because I think one of the things Christians, when you say those books, they start to feel overwhelmed. Like, well, that I have to be an expert before I can engage. And I think you would agree with me in saying that you don't have to be an expert to engage. Just know what you know and be willing to accept that, and then ease into it. As you know more, then you're more informed. But start with what you know, and strive to know more is I guess what I would say. And don't feel overwhelmed by the process. men and women over the years have spent their entire lives pursuing these things and provided the resources for us to follow in their trails. So I guess I would just encourage people in that, read these books, but while you're reading them, don't be afraid to stand on what you do know currently. And then as you read, play with the thoughts and have the discussions and have the discourse as you come across it.
Another book, and this will be a challenging book, but Rutherford's Lex Rex. Samuel Rutherford's Lex Rex is a good one. That's probably the most challenging of the political theology books to read. I think another one that would be helpful would be so Brad Littlejohn has this little book called something about the two kingdoms. It's an introduction to kind of an Anglican version of two kingdoms, and I don't fully subscribe to it, but I think it's a good introduction to two kingdom theology as classically understood. So I think it's something like
that's more the way Luther understood two kingdom theology.
He thinks that Luther, Calvin, and Richard Hooker all kind of had very similar. I mean, I don't think that's right, but that doesn't matter. I think it's just a good introduction for the most part of two kingdom theology as classically understood. It's like, Brad Littlejohn, Two Kingdoms.
Gotcha.
I think also David Innes. I think David Innes has a book called Christ and. Anyway, I don't have it in front of me, but INNES. I think he has a good book on political theology as well. So that's probably more accessible. Those previous two. So, or my book in a couple of months. Buy that one.
Well, I want to thank you again. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, as soon as it comes out, I follow you on Twitter, so I'll definitely
hopefully October,
I'll
September,
definitely promote that for whatever it's worth for the few followers. Great, looking forward to that. So, well, thanks again, Stephen, and we really appreciate the time and the insight and the clarity. And like Bradley said, we want to encourage our listeners, pursue what you can, right? Pursue discussion, pursue learning, pursue knowledge, and let's not be. I was really challenged by you, Stephen, to not be the kind of person who thinks, well, I read, an article, now I'm an expert on this idea. And so just thanks for the clarity and the depth that you brought to the discussion.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. It was fun.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Yeah. For our listeners, if you're listening and we haven't released our follow-up episode yet, feel free to chime in, send us an email or a couple comments about this, and we'll be glad to read them or interact with them. And if you... no, I already said that about the podcast and the YouTube channel. So thanks so much for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you next time.